Hi, and welcome to the Right to Remain Silent podcast. I'm Jim Weber, your host and guide through actual accounts of intriguing and fascinating true crime stories as told by the law enforcement professional that experienced the event. The Right to Remain Silent podcast makes no exaggeration of fact, doesn't glamorize details, or sensationalize reality. The format here is basic. Real stories from real cops. Lastly, please don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, and share. Doing this will help me continue to provide you, the listener, with captivating and relevant true crime stories. Now, let's listen in on today's episode. Hi, and welcome to today's episode of the Right to Remain Silent podcast. Today's guest is Jerry Hester, a retired special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. During our conversation today, Jerry will discuss his role as the lead investigator of Operation Paisan Blues, a multi-year FBI international undercover investigation of the mafia in the Miami, Florida area, with deep ties to Italy. Jerry, I'm going to go ahead and start out with your bio here and let the listeners know a little bit about who we're talking with today. So, Jerry Hester is currently an integrity representative with the National Football League Security Department. He conducts and oversees game day security for players and referees. In addition, he oversees compliance with NFL policies as it relates to the legalized sports betting industry. Prior to working for the NFL, Jerry retired with the Federal Bureau of Investigation as a special agent. While he worked with the FBI, Jerry conducted criminal investigations into matters involving organized crime, narcotics, public corruption, and counterterrorism. During his career, Jerry worked in the Miami and San Francisco FBI field offices. Prior to working for the FBI, Jerry worked as a financial auditor for the state of Ohio, where he conducted audits of state and local government agencies. Jerry is also a veteran of the United States Air Force. While in the Air Force, he worked as a security policeman at Randolph Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. Jerry wrote the book Mafia Miami, FBI Politics and How an Investigation Was Nearly Sabotaged, which was published by Rowman and Littlefield. His book details the FBI Italian organized crime investigation that he led while in the Miami field office. His book also provides an inside look at conducting an FBI investigation and discusses how and why the FBI culture has changed over the years. Well, Jerry, that is an impressive bio. It seems like you've worked a wide variety of the investigative components of the FBI. And thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Jim. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Before we get started here in talking about your investigation, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? I know we just went over your bio, but tell us about your law enforcement career, why you got into law enforcement, and how you ended up with the FBI.
Thanks, Jim. Yes, right out of high school, I enlisted in the United States Air Force and joined the security police unit in San Antonio, Texas. So that's kind of where I got my first taste of law enforcement, developed my interest into law enforcement. And during that time when I was with the Air Force, I went to college, attained my bachelor's degree in accounting. And once, even before graduating, I was in discussion with some FBI applicant coordinators about joining the FBI. It took a few years to finally get in the FBI. I had to get some work experience before I was blessed to have the opportunity to join the FBI. But I guess you could say, from early on, I had that interest in law enforcement. So, I know it sounds kind of corny, but I can remember back being 5 years old. My mom has a picture of me in a a fedora with a little suit, like Hawaii 5 type garb, with a little toy pistol, which has a picture of me there. So I don't know. Maybe it just started back then watching Hawaii 5. Who knows? But it
Yep.
ended up well.
Good deal. Yeah, that is funny. That's kind of when people ask me, "Hey, why'd you get into law enforcement?" I reflect back to the old days and shows just like that, the old original Hawaii 5, the
Right.
Starsky and Hutch, the Kojak shows. So yeah, yeah, it sounds like maybe we have something in common there. Um,
Absolutely.
let's before we get into the details of your investigation, like I said, we're going to talk about your case involving the mafia in Miami. But let's just kind of talk about the mafia in general. Could you just kind of give listeners an idea of what the mafia is? We always hear about it on the History Channel, Discovery channels, television, crime dramas. But just in your experience, just kind of lay a little foundation of what the mafia is and how it operates.
Sure. Yes. As far as organized crime is just quite simply a group of individuals committing criminal activity in concert as one group. So that is kind of how we look at the mafia as well. The mafia is used in a general sense. You have Russian mafia, you have Italian mafia, and for discussions today, we'll talk about the Italian mafia. The Italian mafia originated in Italy, in Sicily primarily. So there are specific Italian Sicilian groups there. But in the early 1900s, you had a lot of those individuals immigrate here to the United States, and they created their own mafia here, the Italian mafia, La Cosa Nostra is what they call it, this thing of ours, which is what that means. And in the United States, and primarily New York, and that's not to take away from some of the groups out of Chicago and even Ohio, Cleveland. There are mafia groups there, but the primary groups are based out of New York. You have the Bonanno family, you have the Colombo family, the Genovese, the Gambino, and Lucchese families out of New York. So that's just a general rundown of mafia. And in the United States, historically, you have these Italian groups out of New York. Um, they're involved with garbage collection. They're getting a piece of that construction, the garment industry, the dock workers, the unions. They infiltrated those groups early on, and that's how they made their name, made their work known, as far as infiltrating groups, committing criminal activity, and as far as extortion. You know, they're also involved with bookmaking and crimes on and on and on.
Sure.
So that's just a general overview of the mafia. Now, in regards to the investigation that I worked, Operation Paisan Blues, I just want to give a little background of that. In South Florida, what we found early on was that a lot of these New York individuals associated with these mafia groups would come to Florida, whether it would be just for vacation purposes, whether to take up residence there to try to start business in South Florida, because South Florida was open. In other words, no particular American mafia group controlled South Florida. So it was kind of like the Wild West. A lot of these guys would come down,
Sure.
develop roots, start up their own criminal enterprise down there. So that's kind of what we found and what we had when I started this investigation. So hopefully that gives you a quick background
Sure,
of the mafia.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. You and I coming from law enforcement, we have a general, and you, in particular, have a specific knowledge because, we were exposed to this when we investigated these type of organizations. But I appreciate your description for listeners that might not be as familiar with what it is and how it operates. So thanks. So now that we kind of have a foundation of what the mafia is, let's go ahead and start talking about your specific investigation. I can't wait to roll up the sleeves and get to work on discussing this here. Let me mention this. If I misstate a fact or something that we're discussing here, please feel free to correct me. Interrupt and correct me because I don't want to misstate something. You worked this multi-year investigation. You lived it. You breathed it. You're familiar with it. So if I misstate something, please feel free to correct me as we go along here.
Okay.
Absolutely. So let's just go ahead and transition into you talking about this case, how you got it, like you're working in Miami. How did Jerry get this case assigned to him? How did it unfold? And then we'll work towards conclusion of how your case concluded. And I may just interject a question or two as we go along here, but I really don't want to interrupt you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. I appreciate it. Yeah, this investigation started in 2006. I had recently transferred to the organized crime squad in Miami, the Miami FBI division. I'd previously been working terrorism after 9/11. As you well know, Jim, so many FBI agents were transferred over to the terrorism squads. So I worked there for a few years and got back on my own accord, back to the organized crime, the criminal branch, which is where my heart really was. So I
Yeah,
was able to finagle my way back in 2006 to the organized crime squad in Miami. And it was it's kind of amazing how it happened. But not long after I arrived on the Miami organized crime squad, I received a lead from my supervisor on the Miami organized crime squad. It was a lead from League at Rome. League at Rome is, we call our League at offices, they're international offices for the FBI. We have them all over the world. League at Rome, which is an FBI office, gave me a tip that they received from the Italian National Police, which I'll call the INP. The INP was instrumental in this initiating this investigation. But the INP sent a lead to Miami FBI, basically saying there's a high level, mid to high level mafioso living and operating right in your backyard in Miami. So once I received the lead, did my background on it, confirmed this individual. I'm just going to call him Roberto just for
sure.
discussion purposes today. So Roberto was living in the Miami Beach area. We confirmed that he was there, did our background checks on him. I received tons of intelligence from the INP. They had really done their homework. They had been investigating this individual for many years. He was closely connected to the highest levels of Sicilian organized crime. And he was now I found working in Miami, purporting to be a wine dealer. And so that's how the investigation was initiated, which interestingly enough, the way it was initiated was the way I had never worked any investigation in my entire FBI career before, since actually. It was began in a manner that I advised all younger agents at that time to never do, which was start an investigation without an informant. And Jim, I know you can appreciate that. Every investigation that I had worked before and since, you develop a good informant in whatever branch you're working, whether it's organized crime, public corruption, drugs, whatever. The informant brings you the information about your bad guy, and you do your background checks, you do your preliminary investigation, you open up a case, and you're off to the races because you have this individual embedded in your organization, right?
Sure. Sure.
So
They're
that's not how this
soliciting that
began.
information for you.
Exactly. That's one thing that law enforcement, federal agents, were trained to do. So this case began backwards, in a backwards manner, for lack of a better term, and that I had a subject, and I used to joke with the newer agents and say anybody can find a bad guy, find the informant to tell you about the bad guy. Well, I didn't do that because at that time, when I was given this information on Roberto and the Sicilian mafia ties, I was told by League at Rome and soon thereafter headquarters, FBI headquarters, that this is a big deal. This is a big case. This is a big target. So I knew I didn't have any choice. I have to pursue this, but I knew right away this is going to be difficult because I didn't have the informant. So lo and behold, I did my preliminary work with the background checks. We quickly established Roberto's connections to not only Sicilian mafia through the IMP, but we also established his connections to the American mafia, primarily the Gambino family. Um, we did our telephone analysis, checking who he's speaking to, not listening to calls, but checking who he's speaking to, and established a flowchart. And he was connected to every other mafia guy in Miami and New York, every not every, but every other celebrity in Miami Beach. As you know, Miami Beach is, the glitz and glamour of South
Right.
Beach, Miami Beach. That's where this guy operated. So he was, um, sort of like a celebrity individual himself, and those are the circles that he ran in. So this is how the investigation began, again, without an informant. So
So he wasn't just your run-of-the-mill ragtag, street running thug. He was a clearly, as you stated, a worthy target of investigation based on information from an entirely different country. And here he is in your backyard. So
exactly,
that sounds
exactly.
very interesting.
And you're exactly right. So once I was to that point, I started going through the intelligence provided by the IMP. Now, the IMP not only had tons of intelligence telling us what who he was connected to, they also had telephone intercepts, because in
Mm,
Italy, their laws aren't as restrictive obtaining telephone calls. They had tons
okay.
of calls of Roberto speaking to the mafioso over there and establishing his connections with them, talking about drug deals that he had been a part of, talking about money laundering deals he'd been a part of, um, talking to his friends offline away from the mafia bosses, talking about how the mafia bosses were afraid of him. Um, and that was because Roberto was at one point an enforcer for a lot of these guys, the
Mm,
intelligence I got from the IMP. So he was your tough guy. He was your, as you know, enforcer is the guy that instills discipline in the organization, beats up or worse for the mafia bosses, right? So he was one of those guys. I think he was a former kickboxer. Um, the Italians kind of told me in a way that he was responsible for bodies, meaning he'd killed people before. So
mm.
this was the type of guy that we knew we were dealing with. And Jim, as you will understand, I mean, that's all fine and dandy. You have all this information about his activities outside of the United States, but I'm being handed this investigation inside the United States for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So I have to establish his probable cause here in the United States.
Right.
Is he committing criminal activity here? Uh, we developed a good start because when we did our analysis, we had determined that he was connected to so many well-known individuals in the mafia world out of New York. There were some of those guys, high-level guys in Miami, uh, who were connected with the ties back to New York. So back to the informant issue. So now the hard work begins. So I'm getting all this headquarters, my supervisor, everyone's cheering me on. Go get them, which was kind of fun at the time. But now the hard work began. So I had to
Right.
find an informant that could provide information on this guy. So eventually, I was able to do that. I was able to find an informant who could establish some current information about what Roberto was doing inside the United States. The informant wasn't a criminal. Um, he was a business person who was able to provide just the surface activity of what this individual was up to in the United States, which was very good. So we were able to establish a probable cause that he was committing criminal activity in the Miami, New York area.
Yeah, not everyone realizes, hey, the FBI doesn't always have a pool of uh, sources of information or, confidential informants that you can just go to the drawer and pull the file, and boom, magically you have an informant that's going to work your case. It takes some street work. It takes some effort sometimes uh, to locate, recruit, and utilize these informants for your specific investigation. So it sounds like you had a little bit of work to do to get to that point right out of the
Very,
gate.
very true. And funny you mentioned that point too, because it kind of gnawed at me being in this situation because I had taken pride in developing good informants over the years, and that was one of the things I was always able to do was have good informants who brought cases to me, investigations to me. So to have a case like this and not have an informant, already in place, it just threw me for a loop initially. But eventually, we were able to establish one who gave us the information we needed to proceed in the investigation, gave us the probable cause to continue. Because as you know, Jim, the FBI, um, I'm not going to spend a lot of time working an investigation just to target an individual. I have to target someone who's committing criminal activity. If he's not committing
Right.
criminal activity, I'll exonerate him and say, hey, there's nothing here. And I've done that before in other investigations. This guy's not doing anything. I'm not working this anymore. So anyway, we were able to establish his criminal activity. He was involved with, uh, initially, we found out he was involved with boiler rooms. And boiler rooms are basically high pressure sales tactics, whether unethical or illegal methods are used, kind of like extortion type activity.
Sure.
So what Roberto would do was he would infiltrate some of these businesses in South Florida, convince them that they needed him for protection. You can operate here because of me, and I can help you with employees or whatever he came up with to because of their business and skim money off the top. So
Yeah, he's
knew
not
right
doing that
away.
out of the goodness of his heart. There's
Exactly.
a motivation. He's going to get that money.
That's all about the money. The greed. You're so true. And one of the things also that we noticed was he was extorting restaurants. One in particular that he on, hung out pretty frequently in Miami Beach. There were times we saw him having lunch or dinner, drinking wine. Um, Never paid the bill, but the owner come to the table with a white envelope and would hand it to him and walk away. So uh, we established a probable cause. Okay, this is a real bad guy. All of the information that the Italians had given us about his organized crime activities, being involved in money laundering, drugs, whatnot, um, we had translated that here. His activities were involving extortion. So we were able to begin the investigation with that. We also suspected him being involved in money laundering in the South Florida area. So now we got to the point where I realized we can't go much further in the investigation with this informant. Um, so it came the time to introduce an undercover FBI undercover agent into the investigation, and that's a whole issue in and of itself with the FBI. Your approval ratings, the approvals to get an undercover investigation are up here compared to opening an investigation. So I won't
Sure.
bore the listeners with all of the details involved with that. But as you know, that's a
There's some
very difficult
stringent
thing.
guidelines there.
That's right. We have to
Yeah.
operate under DOJ guidelines, FBI policy, and the hurdles are high to get those approvals, and rightfully so. I understand all that. Eventually, we were able to introduce an undercover agent into to Roberto, and it was very successful. And I talk about that in a book about the details of how that happened, some of the tactics that we used um, to you know promote that investigative technique. And we were successful with that. We introduced an undercover agent who was purporting to be a cartel money launderer, former drug trafficker. I mean, it's Miami, so I know that's not a
That's not a
stretch, right?
stretch, right?
Yeah, we use that tactic so many times. But It worked very well and over a period of months because it takes that long. Because if you think about it, when a bad guy meets an undercover agent, meets this cartel member, he's not going to automatically trust him. There's an ingratiation period, and we go through that in the book about the difficulties of that, the techniques used, and how your undercover agent has to be on his game to be able to infiltrate this organization. And I use the term organization and Roberto. I use those both,
Sure,
but
kind of use those interchangeably.
interchangeably with that because Roberto did have a group of individuals around him. He had his own right hand man who was his protector. So I use that interchangeably, as you stated. So the undercover investigation began very well. Our undercover was able to ingratiate himself into Centenary, Roberto, rather. And Roberto, after a few months, started talking about his background. And eventually we got on tape, we got on recording him talking about prior money laundering deals, prior drug trafficking deals he had done. He also talked in detail about being connected to the highest levels of Italian mafia in Sicily. So now we're to the point now we're off to the races now because now we've gotten that crucial bit of evidence that this guy is, he is someone who is involved with criminal activity, and he's given us prior crimes he's committed.
I want
And
to
that,
focus
and
in on a something you just said a minute ago there for the benefit of the listeners. You said months. It took months to get to this point with their UC. It's not like TV or the movies where people just think you insert a UC, they sit down at a dinner table in a dark restaurant, and instantly they become friends and business associates. You said it, there's a feeling out process between the undercover and the target of the investigation. So, just for the benefit of the listeners here, to understand why this investigation took, a certain length of time, things don't just happen immediately. There's great effort that's put into this.
so true. And I'm glad you stopped me with that and brought up that point because that brings up another point too. As you said, it takes months to establish that we call the bona fides with the undercover agent. Um, but also what makes this story interesting is that at that time when I began that investigation, this investigation was under what we call the criminal branch as opposed to terrorism and the national security branch within the FBI. At that time, there were not a lot of resources given to the criminal branches. They had taken away a lot of resources, as in personnel, funds, everything. So when I began working this investigation, just a few years earlier, if I'd have had this investigation pre 9/11, I would have had probably 4 or 5 other agents helping me, which will accelerate the case, make it go faster.
Sure.
I didn't have that because there just were no bodies available. And I was continuously getting apologies from my supervisor at the time, Joe Cicini, who was a fantastic supervisor and agent, from my ASAC, which is Assistant Special Agent in Charge, the level over my supervisor. They're like, hey, we're sorry, we just don't have the bodies to give to you. Headquarters, the same thing. The headquarters unit who oversaw the investigation, they were the people who I would go to for approvals, undercover approvals and whatnot. They were always calling me saying, hey, what the hell's Miami doing? When won't they give you bodies? Yeah, I don't know. So,
Right, right.
so, so there was a
Yeah,
lot
this
of
is the
that
time
going
frame
on.
of what, 2006-ish or so, right? So,
2000,
well, like you said,
2006, 7, and 8.
all
Yes.
those resources have transitioned to terrorism. So, just so listeners understand, so you're so right there, and that had to be somewhat frustrating for you.
I was basically working it by myself. I had a partner for a while who eventually, you read the book, he spun off and doing his own thing. So, he had some issues of his own to deal with. So a lot of it early on, I was basically doing it by myself, which is okay, but it took longer, with the developing the informant, making the transition.
Right.
So that's why I'm kind of skimming over, and I'm glad you stopped me because I was kind of skimming over a lot of this period, but a lot of that was crucial to the investigation, developing the informant, coming up with an investigative strategy to introduce the undercover agent. And you're right, those issues took, I mean, those things took months for approvals and operational just to get it done because a Italian mafia member like Roberto, he was he was like, actually, I know it sounds corny, but he was like a Tony Soprano type character, brooding, big tough guy, but very smart and very suspicious. And he was the type of guy, he was very successful. So he could choose who he did business with. He would only do business with individuals who he knew he was going to make a lot of money, but more importantly, individuals that he trusted. So that bona fides and that trust uh, that developed between him and our undercover agent did take months. So good. Like I said, I'm glad that you pointed that out so I could go into that
Sure.
detail as well. So
Sure.
once we got to that point, we were able to come up with investigative strategy. Um, well, the investigative strategy was a lot of times just to let Roberto talk to us, and the undercover would play off of whatever he said. We didn't do a lot of proposing of criminal activity to him because individuals like Roberto and these high level criminals, they'll pick up on a lot of they'll pick up on things like that, and you'll spook them is what I call it. We didn't want to spook the bad guy, right? As you
Right.
say. So we waited for him to propose criminal activity to our undercover agent, and that eventually happened. Um, we were able to establish, I keep using bona fides because that's exactly what it was. Our undercover agent, he had the fancy cars, the fancy houses, he had the girls around him. Bad guys like Roberto, they love this. Remember, this is Miami Beach, so it's flash and cash.
Right. That's the mecca for that behavior and lifestyle.
It really is. And if you don't have it, if you don't have the entourage, you don't have the fancy cars, the Lamborghinis, the Porsches, if you don't have the the girls hanging out with you at these
Right.
fancy restaurants, you're not going to be able to compete. So, in order to, it's very difficult for law enforcement to operate in to infiltrate these high level criminals. But
Right.
it's a technique. It's time consuming, as we've kind of beat that to death. So eventually, we got to that point where Roberto thought to himself, "Okay, these are bad guys. I think they're bad guys. So let me do a proposal to them." And he offered to launder money for the undercover agent. That was one conversation. Once we developed that conversation, the undercover agent brought it back to me, a recording of that conversation. Because, Jim, as you know, that's all investigation is. It doesn't happen quickly. You have a conversation, you listen to it, you find out what you have evidence wise.
You
So,
evaluate it. You talk about it with your coworkers, your supervisor, you
right,
formulate your plan. It doesn't
everybody,
just right.
absolutely. So, and I'm kind of going through this as to how it happened. Some of the things I'm probably skipping over and I'll come back to later. But at this point, um, we received, or I received a call from our League at Rome office. One of the trips back to Sicily that Roberto had taken, um, they had surveilled him in Sicily, and there was an individual that he was meeting with there. They said, I think you need to know who this person is. Go back to your secure computer. We're going to send you a picture and a name. So lo and behold, we find out that Roberto is meeting in Sicily with a high level CIA operative. So this is in
Oh,
the middle of the investigation.
that's got to be
Um,
mind blowing.
it's and I'm not gonna don't want to get into all of the detail with that, but that was just one obstacle that we had to deal with at that time. So uh, so we're working the investigation, trying to come up with investigative strategy, and we have this issue. Around that same time, my supervisor leaves the investigation, leaves the squad. We have turnover, and I talk about that too in the book. I talk about the constant turnover at the management level. I talk about some of the policy and culture changes that were occurring at the FBI at that time that I didn't realize what was going on. Looking back now, I kind of understand it a little better. But I talk about some of the policy changes having to do with um, what I call careerism within the FBI.
Right.
It seemed like the FBI started to promote mid-level, upper management career um, transition management programs and started to prioritize those ahead of investigations. That seemed to be the priority. There was a centralization of power that was occurring at the time um, that I think affected the FBI, affected my investigation most certainly, and looking back, I think affected the FBI overall. And we see with some of the things we see in the news these days, um, I think if you read the book, you'll see some of the culture and policy changes that were occurring, and you may get a little better understanding of how could some of these things that are happening today, well, some of these issues that were occurring back then might be the answer to that.
Right. I think, if I could interject, I think your book is fascinating and it lays out the groundwork on, at the time, it's almost like you can't see the forest through the trees in your situation. But as you reflect back on it, you see how that transitional shift was occurring, as you described, the focus kind of moving towards career versus case. And your book and the way you lay that out is eye-opening. So I suggest people that have an interest in that, get a hold of your book and give it a read.
Thank you. And I bring that up now because at that time, um, with the turnover in our management level, now all of a sudden this case has been going on for a year, maybe a little year plus at that point. Now I have a new supervisor, I have a new ASAC. Before I had wonderful supervisor, wonderful ASAC, and actually that was my ninth or 10th year in the FBI. I had never had any issues with any of my supervisors, ASACs, all outstanding people, competent, smart, mission oriented. And now I had supervisor and ASAC who I quickly learned were not focused on the investigation. They were focused on how the investigation affected them, how they could put their fingerprints on the investigation because they wanted it to succeed only for their career interests. That was I quickly established that early on. Uh, Again, I
Their
won't get
their
into
MO is how can your hard work and effort make them look better?
absolutely. So they've started clipping my wings a little bit and throwing obstacles in my path, trying to make decisions on the investigation that the case agent generally makes. And remember, these are people who just came on the investigation. They don't know anything, how it was created or anything like that. It actually became so bad that at that point I did have a co-case agent. I had someone working the investigation with me. Outstanding agent, actually one of the best agents in all of the Miami division. But this interference with our new management became so bad that he requested to leave the investigation,
Hmm.
go to another squad to get away from these. And I totally understood it. I kind of wanted to go as well, but I couldn't because I was case
Right, you're
agent.
kind of stuck there.
I was stuck. So I'm bringing all this up because it's makes the story more interesting as to, you're trying to work. This was my career case, we call them in the FBI, which is your most significant and important investigation. But it was also among my worst experiences in the FBI because of little issues like this. At this point, I've got to thinking, and I've heard you, sure you've heard this before, that working against the bad guys was easy. It was working with some of my own folks that made it difficult.
You beat me
So
to the punch there. Like, so
yeah,
not only are you working a difficult case that's a high priority that sometimes has little results in these types of cases, you're battling with the turnover of management. You're battling with the behind the scenes, convoluted world of policy changing and that type of thing. So you're I don't think fighting battles is the right term, but you're working several different fronts on your same case there. So it's not just, hey, Jerry wakes up in the morning and I go to the office and I work this Paisan Blues case. you're dealing with a lot of things. I just anticipate I wasn't there with you, but you're dealing with a lot of these issues simultaneously, which makes it that much more difficult for you to have a success rate, it sounds like.
Exactly. It really, really was a difficult time. So at this point, where we left off with the investigation, we were making inroads with Centenary, and so glad you brought it up to the listeners, how long these types of bona fides, these meetings take establishing your credibility with the bad guy. Speaking of the undercover agent, what happened was when we, I had to do ASAC come into the investigation. She wanted the case to go faster. She wanted it to wrap up sooner so it could reflect well on her career because at this point, the FBI, every year and a half or so, some of these managers are turning up. We have turnover. So they got to build their resume. At least that was the new FBI that was establishing at that time. We got to build your resume and get promoted. So she decides to inject herself in the investigation in multiple ways. And you read the book, you'll see some of it. Some of it's unbelievable. But one of the ways that she affected it uh, negatively was she started calling my undercover agents. I'm the case agent. I deal with my undercover agents. Our undercover agents were outstanding, most experienced guys in the FBI. As a matter of fact, they were part of our what we call our well, don't want to use the name. They were part of our undercover unit, so they were the elite of the elite. But this investigation, because we're targeting high level Italian mafia guys, it takes time, right? Well, it wasn't going fast enough for her. So she comes into the investigation. I brief her on it. She wants the undercovers to work faster. So she calls them, reads them the riot act, gives them a hard time about it. These are 20-plus year guys. They're eligible to retire. They're just doing this because they're good at it and they like doing it. So they listen to her, they get off the phone and they call me and they're like, Jerry, we like you. We like this investigation, but if she calls me again, I'm out of here. So she stirred the pot with my undercover agents right before a crucial meeting with Roberto. We have the crucial meeting with Roberto. It goes on as scheduled. These guys are kind of ticked off, the undercovers anyway. And they go in and we have a pretty good discussion. They talk about laundering money together, which is huge for the case because if we can launder money with Roberto, my gosh, we can jam him up, maybe eventually flip him, get into the hierarchy, which is how we work investigations
Yeah, that's
to
great
federal
progress
level.
right there.
With the people that this guy knows in the United States, high level Gambino guys, high level mafia guys all over, like, wow, we're off to the races. Right after that meeting with the undercovers, I briefed them. The conversation went well. Um, but soon thereafter, Roberto won't return their phone calls. So, make a long story short, somehow or another, he gets spooked. We find out through another informant later that he basically said, I think those guys, meaning the undercover agents, these guys are cops. So he walks away. So at this point, so as you know, Jim, that can happen. That happens sometimes. But I actually think the blame for that was because my undercover agents got riled up because of this manager injecting herself where she had no business being one of
Sure,
them.
that's distracting to the undercovers. You said it. They're focused on the goal of working that target, and that causes confusion and safety issues when
Right.
somebody uh, interjects and kind of like stirs up that beehive a little bit. So I completely understand that happening.
Absolutely. And you're so right and so well stated the way you said it, the sensitivity of the circumstances with the undercover agent and they have to be focused. And one part that I left out was just so the listener understands when you're an undercover agent with the FBI doesn't say, okay, Jim, you're an undercover agent, you're going to go work this case. It doesn't work that way. Undercover agents, it's all volunteer. If they don't want to work an investigation, they don't have to. So that's why when they initially had called me and said, listen, we like you and we like working the case, but if we get another call from her, we're out of here, meaning we're not going to work here anymore. So
Sure.
it did rile them up to the point where I think it maybe knocked them off their game. They were a little unbalanced and maybe lost, it's human nature, maybe lost some interest. Not overtly, but,
Right.
unconsciously,
Understandably so.
understandably so. So I really think that's what happened at that time. But anyway, I digress. And,
So you hit that obstacle. That's a gut punch for you right
that
there.
was a huge gut punch. At that point, and again, just a quick little blurb, we were able to transition to one of Roberto's lieutenants, and we were actually able to infiltrate him. We were able to actually get another undercover agent with him, and he was laundering money for our undercover agent, transporting contraband for him. So we were able to transition quickly on that angle, but he wasn't the target. So one of my favorite sayings is, "It's better to be lucky than good." And at that point in time, that's when, out of nowhere, we receive a high-level cooperator, a well-known celebrity attorney in South Florida, Fort Lauderdale area by the name of Scott Rothstein, who was at that time involved with a $2 billion Ponzi scheme that came
Oh,
crashing down around him. And he began cooperating with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Lo and behold, you remember me talking about that telephone investigation, telephone background analysis that we had done at the beginning of the case.
sure.
Scott Rothstein was on Roberto's call list. So we were able to develop this celebrity attorney as a cooperator. Um, so at that point in time, he began cooperating with us, and we were able to construct some deals with Roberto involving money laundering, um, obstruction of justice charges we were able to obtain through him. So that's again just a quick outline of how the investigation ended. We were able to arrest our subjects, Roberto Antonio Tricamo, who was Roberto's right-hand man. We were able to get money laundering charges on, contraband charges, all because of the cooperation of Scott Rothstein. Now, Scott Rothstein, there are books written about him. If people Google him, multiple books because of his activities. He's currently serving 50 years in prison for his activities. So, yeah, this investigation, I think, has a lot of things. And just a quick bullet points of it all. We have the Italian mafia. We have from Sicily. We have Gambinos from New York. Some of the Gambinos in the investigation, with names like Frankie the Hat, Jackie the Nose. Uh, we have the Miami Beach backdrop, and I didn't get into a lot of that, but if you read the book, you'll appreciate that, the flash and cash that I talk about. We have the high-level CIA operative who showed up in the middle of the case. That's a really cool story in and of itself. Um, and he muddies the waters for me for a while because, as you know, working in an investigation, criminal case, at that time, I was told it was the biggest Italian organized crime case in the Bureau. But CIA, national security, that stuff trumps you. So when
Sure.
he showed up in the investigation, I thought, is this
This
going to
is the
derail
end.
my entire? This could be the end, and it almost was. So there's a whole chapter in the book about that, and I don't use his name. I know who he is, this operative. Interesting story behind it. So that's something of interest there. But anyway, just that was a quick rundown of the case. And throughout the book, I do talk about the policy and culture change. We discussed that. And I think also of interest, I discuss going along the way. I talk about how to operate an FBI investigation from beginning to end. I talk about developing the informants to probable cause, handling your undercover agents, dealing with your coworkers, dealing with the U.S. Attorney's Office. So it's kind of like little how-to on how to work an investigation, how to handle informants, meaning, how your relationship with them, the guidelines that you have to abide by
Right.
with the FBI. Um, so,
I wish
and
your
then
book was available when I got into law enforcement so I could have used it as a roadmap because you did, I mean, so many different things happened to you that you encountered and dealt with from beginning to end on this.
it really was. And that's what makes the story interesting is that it was like the perfect storm of things that could go wrong while you're working your career case. It really was. And that was one of the things that when I finished the book, this is all nonfiction. So it is what it is. I had to write it as it happened. But at times in there, I'm critical of a particular agent here and there. I don't use the real names for the one or two that I criticize in there. Um, but I talk about that because it's what happened with the story. And it was, like I said, the perfect storm of things that could go wrong. Just a bad partner at this point, bad supervisor, a bad ASAC, bad AUSA. I've never experienced anything before or since that time to this level. Again, that's why I made it an interesting story. Um, but I guess I'm bringing that up because I don't want to think for people to think that it's all negative because it's not. A lot
Oh,
of it is
no.
positive, and I try to remain optimistic throughout the whole time, and that's kind of the story as I persevere and finally finish the case. We arrest our bad guys and then move on with the rest of my career. So anyway, hopefully I'm not rambling too much, but that's
Oh,
kind
no,
of
not at all.
sure.
But how about so the two primary defendants in your investigation, how did it conclude for them? Were you able to personally put cuffs on them and arrest them? Did they cooperate with you? And kind of just maybe briefly, what were they charged with and what were their sentences?
Yeah. Yes, the main target, Roberto, we were able to charge him with $10 million money laundering charges and obstruction of justice. Um, and no, he did not cooperate. It wasn't a surprise if he did not cooperate. Um, it was a 3.5 year investigation. As you know, when you work these investigations, you know your main bad guy very well. You know everything about him. What I'm getting at is that my vision of once we did arrest him, and we did arrest him, and he served 4 years in prison for his charges. But the main objective upon arresting him is to get him to cooperate, right? Um, and when you're dealing with mafia members, they're all about respect. It's all about honor and respect. And we talk about that in the book too. What am I getting at? Well, my plan for arresting someone of this stature is not to do a fancy arrest, knocking on the door and beating down his door and pulling him out in his underwear and arresting him. You don't deal with a guy like this. This is a high level guy. My vision was to walk up to him on Lincoln Road. For those of you who are familiar with Miami Beach, that's the cool place on Miami Beach where Roberto hung out every day. Walk up to him while he's sitting down having his wine and his Italian food at, ironically enough, the restaurant I hung out was called Soprano Cafe. So I say, you can't make this stuff up. That's a true story. It's absolutely
Wow.
true.
And
So
wasn't that about the time frame Sopranos
it
was
was
going on? Wow.
absolutely, yeah. And so anyway, let me get back to my point here. So when it came time, when we had all the evidence on him to do the arrest, I wanted to walk up on Lincoln Road, sit down, show him the badge, and say, Roberto, we need to talk. That treat him with respect, take him somewhere and say, listen, I have A, B, and C hammers over you. You have two choices. You can cooperate or you can go to jail for 20 years, 10 years, whatever. That was my plan. Well, talking about my new ASAC with all of these career aspirations,
Mhm.
she would not let me do that. She said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do a SWAT arrest. We're going to arrest him at his fancy Miami Beach condo with flashbangs and knocking down his door. And they literally, well, knocked down his door and broke his door. So
Mhm.
You took all of that away from me. And those are case agent decisions that you make. She says, no, we're going to do it this way.
Right.
And I told her, I said, he's never going to cooperate if we do that. If we arrest him in front of his wife, embarrass him, it's done. She said, oh, you don't know that. I don't know that. The guy who's worked the case for 3 years. So
Right.
you asked the question about the cooperating. He probably would not have cooperated. Maybe not, but who knows? If I'd have been allowed to handle it the right way, even if he didn't, that's how you handle those types of things. You don't go breaking down doors just because you can.
Correct.
So no, he did not cooperate at all. As a matter of fact, his defense attorney, was quite adamant about that at the time. And I'll get back to him in a minute. But so
Sure.
moving on to Antonio Tricamo, his right-hand man. Tricamo was arrested for money laundering charges of millions of dollars. Um, the transportation of contraband. He was dealing in counterfeit cigarettes. We had evidence of that. So we were able to put him away for a couple of years. He was uh, a green card holder at that time. So he was eventually deported after he served his time. So that was so that's a quick rundown of the two main targets. There was two other underlings that Roberto had involved with him while he was laundering money for Mr. Scott Rothstein.
Mhm.
They did time as well for their conspiracy, their involvement with that. Um, I mentioned the defense attorney. I noticed on Amazon, on my where my book can be found, Mafia Miami can be found on Amazon. There's reviews people can do, and the defense attorney actually put a review on there. He didn't use his real
Really?
name, but he actually
Really?
said he was and he was complaining about how Roberto had done his time and that there was no mafia association, that's all made up and it's a disgruntled agent, on and on and on. But the reason I bring that up is because I thought in the book, I spend probably a quarter of the book establishing the mafia association of Roberto. So,
Sure.
um, but
Yeah,
that's
that's a pretty
part and
intricate part of the
parcel.
whole investigation.
Exactly, exactly. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question about the cooperation of those. But simultaneously, and I didn't speak any of it here, but in the investigation, you'll see, or I'm sorry, in the book, you'll see that there was a parallel investigation worked out of our New York office, where New York was working against Gambino members who were connected to Roberto, and so we did simultaneous arrests. So their New York subjects were arrested when our Miami subjects were arrested. And that was a whole big ordeal too. And also the INP conducted arrests all at the same time. In other words, we did our takedown of arrests at the same times. New York, Miami, and Italy, all subjects related to Roberto.
That's quite a
So
coordinated effort to do that, to bring it to conclusion like that. That in itself takes a lot of work.
my gosh, so much, yeah. Planning and everything has to be just right. And you're dealing with multiple agencies. Um, Italy's 6 hours ahead, so you have to deal with the time difference and all of that. But so
Mhm.
that's all in the book, Mafia Miami, which is available on Amazon, and the publisher Roman and Littlefield. It's available on Roman.com, Roman and Littlefield's website. So
Okay. Is
that
that Roman, ROWMAN.com?
correct.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And
Yeah. For
like I
listeners
said,
that, no, I'm sorry, for listeners that are interested in your book, and I highly recommend it. I've got it right here. It's a fascinating read, and I highly recommend it. So well written, like we were talking offline before we started here, concise, organized, well written book. And I've suggested it. In fact, after today, several of my friends, I've got a little wait list. I'm lending my book to them, so they're
thank you.
looking forward to reading it. But let's talk about what you're doing now, after you've been retired for a number of years from the FBI. Tell us a little bit about afterlife.
Yes, I retired in 2018. I can't believe it's been 6 years now since I've left the FBI. But I'm currently I work in the security unit with the National Football League, the NFL. which is it's a uh, great job. It's a job where I do investigations over policy violations of players, officials. I also do physical security. I attend NFL games, provide game day security and whatnot. So um, it's that's something that keeps me busy. You know, we have meetings, football games, conferences, and whatnot. So it's what I call a full-time title and part-time hours, which is perfect thing for retirement.
Yeah, sounds like it, exactly. Um, Again, so folks can get your book at Roman.com, right?
And Amazon.
And
And Amazon.
Amazon. All
Yes,
right.
sir.
Mafia Miami, Jerry Hester. So, again, hey, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be a guest with us here today on the Right to Remain Silent podcast. It was a very interesting narrative of your case and your investigation of these mafia members, in addition to the way you broke it down today, was just fascinating, and I appreciate it. Again, I can't say it enough. If you're a true crime enthusiast, that book is a very good read. Um, and I'll go ahead and conclude it here for today, and thank the listeners. I'm confident they were on the edge of their seat just like I was. I'm a 30-year law enforcement veteran, and just listening to how your case unfolded today was super fascinating. And one last thing to the listeners, please remember to follow, subscribe, like, and share so that I can continue to bring high caliber guests like Jerry to our podcast. Again, I appreciate your time, Jerry.
Thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. And everybody stay safe out there. The Right to Remain Silent podcast is brought to you by Streetwise 360 Studios. I would like to again thank today's guest for sharing the story right here on the podcast. Please remember to like, follow, share, and recommend us so that I can continue to bring you high caliber guests sharing their experiences just like we heard today. If your law enforcement agency is interested in training provided by Streetwise 360, or if you know someone that has an interesting law enforcement story to share, please contact me via the website, www.streetwise-360.com, www.streetwise-360.com.